17-minute clip.
Why don't we do the 2 7-minute clips and call Nicole?
They're all part of the same excerpts from the same film.
I believe
Great.
so.
Yeah.
And tell me if this is too loud for you or not loud enough.
I don't hear anything.
You can't hear that?
It's just wind.
Are you okay?
What high school class are you? Texas, West Texas.
There's no missing on the bumps, and I'm trying to slow down for the worst ones. Keep them in better shape, but that's all I can tell you. It's got away from me. Quail birds up here always scatter grain everywhere, and they come get me out of the house in the morning, so that helps. It gives me something to do. As you can see, the pipe down here on the left, where they've come across us today, and when we were watching that machine, he's probably just down over this hill, but we really probably will drop down in the draw before we get to where we could see where that machine was working. I wouldn't have believed it if it hadn't happened to me. But we were just looking at before we knew it would cross, and we were out walking around just checking out the area, and we found a stake behind a bush on right next to the road, and then as we got to walking each way, we started finding stakes that were out in the pasture. Looks like they're going to work late tonight. When we got looking farther, then we found more and more stakes, and at that point we understood what had happened, that they hadn't even gotten permission to come and survey it. But like I say, it's just the way it played out, and it turned out we couldn't stop them anyway. We had to give them permission to come back for the third time and stake it. And it's just the way the law's been changed in their favor through the years. Basically, the landowner has no rights.
Last night, the company behind the planned Trans-Pecos pipeline hosted 2 open house meetings in Presidio and Alpine. Lauren Madelon was at the meeting in Alpine last night. And Lauren, what was the overall feeling?
Well, for many pipeline opponents, there honestly was a sense of dread and inevitability and a curiosity, frankly, about what legal options might be open to them. And I should point out that 2 weeks ago, the Texas Railroad Commission granted the company Energy Transfer public utility status, and with that comes the power to use eminent domain to seize land from private landowners who refuse to deal with the company. So the state has ruled that this project is in the public interest, even though the gas is destined to serve Mexican electricity plants. It's financed by Mexico, as we mentioned, and also includes investment from Carlos Slim, Mexico's richest man. And the pipeline opposition is making some strange bedfellows, namely an alliance of conservative landowners and ranchers and environmentalists. Here's David Keller of the Big Bend Conservation Alliance.
We want cleaner energy from Mexico, of course, but not at the expense of the Big Bend. But, you know, again, I think that the ground on which they're standing for those eminent domain proceedings is very weak. And that really brings it all into question. Do they have a true standing to pull eminent domain?
So Texas has a wonderful 100-year-plus history with the oil and gas industry. In Texas, there is no permit required to route a pipeline. So you, the pipeline company, would go negotiate with a property owner, and if that property owner was interested in doing business with you, they would grant you an easement to run your pipeline across their property. But there are people who aren't interested in selling, who aren't interested in having a pipeline on their property, and they fall into a class called the unwilling seller. So in Texas, the law empowers the pipeline company to acquire that easement through the process of eminent domain condemnation, to basically take the property from you, whether you want to sell it or not.
When I first came to this country, the terrain, the topography appealed to me, and climate appealed to me, and the undisturbed nature of it appealed to me, and that's what drew me here and kept me here. I love seeing country that has largely been unaffected by habitation. I don't even like looking at farmland because I feel like it needs to be natural. I like country to look like it looked when it was created, or as close to that as possible. I hate to see country disturbed. It scares me that the whole area could change. A little over a year ago, I guess, we got our first offer from the pipeline company. We've been receiving information in the mail that the project was planned and that it was going to happen. Pipeline had been approved, and the pipeline company would have the power of eminent domain. And it was about a year ago that we finally got our first offer from the pipeline company. And up until that time, we didn't really know exactly when it was going to happen, but it was with dread that we looked forward to each piece of information that we were going to get. The offer that we got right out a year ago in a letter was a little bit absurd. I can't tell you how many hours I spent on the telephone talking to people and trying to come up with a better solution for us. And we finally retained an attorney who had negotiated some pipeline easements, and he was very helpful. But it seems like when we hired legal counsel, then it doubled the amount of work I had to do, because he was continually asking for more information from this end, what's happening. It was consuming a large portion of my thought every day. Couldn't concentrate near as much on what I wanted to be doing as I wanted to, but I was trying to protect us a little bit more. I knew I didn't want cattle on the construction zone, so we started planning to build a mile of fence so that we could keep our cattle on land that we owned off of the pipeline easement. And a mile of fence in this area is probably a $12,000 to $15,000 investment, which took a square mile of our country out of production, which ordinarily would have supported 20, 25 mature cows and their calves. I rather resent the fact that we have to put so much effort into reprogramming our ranch operation to fit this. Someone had read it in the paper that the company had filed condemnation proceedings on us because we hadn't accepted any of their prior offers. So when our attorney found that out, well, he got in touch with the pipeline company and said, look, we're still trying to negotiate with you people. And they said, oh, well, that came from higher up. That came from the main office. Those proceedings, don't worry about it. But yet they set a hearing date and actually appointed the special commissioners to hear our case. And our attorney found out that the pipeline people had actually contacted some of the special commissioners that were appointed to hear our case before it ever came to hearing. And the final offer that they gave us was less than half of what they had originally offered in the very beginning. I'd like for someone to give me a reason that supports the construction of this pipeline that doesn't involve money. That I can't get my mind around.
was that made? Do you know?
She's making it now.
Oh, okay. So these are clips, and the whole thing hasn't been put together yet. Is that?
I think that it has been, I think construction is finished. I'm not
Oh no, I
certain.
mean the movie.
The way we saw it was 3 separate clips that had not been.
But that's what she's in the process of doing. So let's put it all together.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Nicole.
Hi, Nicole. This is Robin Chestnut Tangerman.
Hi, Robin.
How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, thanks. You're on a speakerphone in our committee. There are 9 committee members and 5 other people in the room. And we've just watched the first 2 clips of the film. And we wanted to connect, phone you in and start the conversation.
Okay, great. Yeah, remind me which clips you watched. I sent a couple that we showed there in Vermont, and then the Eminent Domain Town Hall. I don't know if you had gotten to that one as well.
So we did not see that. We saw 2 7-minute clips
Okay.
that I saw at Vermont Law School.
Okay, got it. Alrighty. Well, hi everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm very honored to share the story and certainly press this very important issue. So happy to be with you.
Can you tell us a little bit, I'm sorry, this is Tim Briglin, I'm the chair of the committee. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the story in that part of Texas and, where things stand right now? There was a little bit of verbiage on the screen at the end of the second clip we watched that gave a little information about where things stand now, but if you can, if you can fill out some of the story, that would be great to hear.
Sure. So essentially, just to give you the background of the Trans-Pecos pipeline, which was the instigation of this film, it's backed by Energy Transfer Partners, the same company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline. They're out of Dallas, Texas, and it's between them and an entity called CFE, Comisión de Federal de Electricidad, which is also working in tandem with Carlos Slim in Mexico. So the play is essentially to ideally transport 1.4 billion cubic feet of natural gas from the Waha hub in the Permian Basin through the Big Bend region, and consequently taking 41 landowners' land through the process of eminent domain, getting it into Mexico, where very strong evidence is revealing that they're liquefying it, and bifurcating the route within Mexico to the port called Topolobampo, where they're essentially selling it to the Asian market. So there's been multiple infrastructure built within Mexico. There's been a lot of storage facility built. There's essentially no public use within the United States. There's a very odd building of a seasonal chili plant, which happened a couple years ago. It was built out near a little town called Presidio, which is essentially the only U.S. access. And there's a 6-inch line going into this chili plant. And essentially, like I said, they're receiving enough gas, which is the equivalent of the amount of gas that would be leaking from a pipeline of this magnitude. There's been 4 auctions in Mexico to buy the gas. No one has bought it, and much of this has to do with Mexico's inability to build the necessary infrastructure to actually get LNG and natural gas to these communities and within the country. And so again, a lot of the play for a lot of companies is to get this across the border of Texas and into Mexico, again, this regulatory light environment, and selling it overseas. versus going through places like California or Washington or Oregon, where a permit would be necessary and it could take as long as a decade to get it to the Pacific coast. Like I said, with Robin and the rest of that audience, during the time of the Trans-Pecos pipeline, there's a buyout by a company called Apache. Approximately 300,000 acres of mineral rights were bought out. The plan is there's approximately 10,000 frac wells on the way. There's been multiple companies buying into what's called the Alpine High. It's essentially the largest oil find in decades, really, on the continent. And having access to this oil and gas, again, is a very big play in terms of getting it overseas. As it stands, as we all are well aware, natural gas fluctuates. So as it stands at the moment, it's in the negative in this particular region of the Permian Basin. And so what happens is companies either going to shut in, which they're most likely not going to do, or flare the gas, or work very diligently to try and get it to the border where they can at least break even or possibly create a profit. So that's why this particular area is quite auspicious about what's happening nationally, but also globally. And so as we're all well aware, we start selling our fairly inexpensive natural gas, which obviously fluctuates, but getting it overseas, you can sell it to $10, $15 more per cubic foot. And that, that affects our food, that affects our agriculture, and so on and so forth. So I did just receive, there's a gentleman called Gordon Gibson who is kind of the equivalent of an Ed Snowden within the oil and gas industry, who's been instrumental in this story. He's a volunteer for the Big Bend Conservation Alliance, and really a lot of the reason why I've stayed on this story for as long as I have. He's a former pipeline engineer, control and systems engineer, both in the States as well as internationally. So he really has the wherewithal to find all of this information. He sent me not very long ago some information about a new project called the Lockridge Extension Pipeline. It's proposed by a Natural Gas Pipeline of America, and essentially is going to be interconnected to the Trans-Pecos pipeline. So what's happening is, due to this Apache buyout and the infrastructure that's being built by virtue of that, there's been laterals tied into not only just Trans-Pecos pipeline, but now this new potential Lockridge Extension pipeline, and it just is continually coming. And all this being said, as I mentioned within the issue of eminent domain as it stands in Texas, any private company is essentially able to obtain a permit from the Texas Railroad Commission and have a box checked to read common carrier, which gives them the authority to use eminent domain to transport. So, yeah.
Nicole, this is Robin again, can you talk a little bit about the legal structures or legal fictions of it being an intrastate pipeline and the border crossing?
Sure. So essentially, as I mentioned, like, private companies are able to obtain a permit through the Texas Railroad Commission. So they are able to constitute, in this case, the Trans-Pecos pipeline, an intrastate pipeline, meaning that it's staying within state lines. However, it's obviously an interstate. It crosses the border. And this is a tactic, and it's essentially a loophole in the law of NEPA, and this actually happened in North Dakota as well, where they segment the project out. So essentially the 148 miles of the Trans-Pecos pipeline is owned by Energy Transfer Partners in Texas. There's then 1,080 feet that crosses the Rio Grande, which is owned by no one, strangely, and then it's reattached to another pipe owned by CFE. So by virtue of segmenting it out, you then become exempt from being classified as an interstate versus intrastate, and by virtue of that, you're exempt from a federal permit as well as an environmental survey, and it obviously speeds up the process. So they're then able to go to Texas Railroad Commission and ask for an export permit. Texas Railroad Commission then just stamps it, And it's just, by virtue of what we've seen within FERC, it's another common practice where it's just all of this rubber stamping goes on without any kind of, public hearings and essentially, with the way eminent domain is used for any kind of public utility, being transmission lines or roads or railroads, the oil and gas industry is completely exempt from all of these processes. So, so that's essentially what's happened. And so that segmenting, essentially described as impermissible segmentation, is a really valuable thing to look into. And in discussion, obviously this is a Texas story, and whether it can happen in Vermont or any other state, all of these loopholes, then what can bring such concern to asking the question, who's buying this gas, to what benefit, and where is it going? And so if there's not, real strong authority and oversight and actual due process with eminent domain and, all of these stepping points of which these projects are able to take place, we're dealing with, serious national and international repercussions, and obviously repercussions due to climate change.
And can you talk a little bit about the process of eminent domain and the rancher who was said in the film that he was forced to accept an offer that was less than half of the initial offer? How does that work?
Yeah, so Joel Nelson, the rancher, there's some clips of him with his cattle and such. We don't actually have this in the film, but according to him, he was offered a certain amount of money per rod. He said no. I think that's part of the film clip. Energy Transfer came back with a higher price. He said no again, and then Energy Transfer dropped down to lower than their initial offer. So there was a lot of bullying going on, and then I believe they actually they have to sign. There's none of this is public record, and actually James Sprague, the other gentleman, was really concerned about being in the film because they had to sign a statement saying that they can't reveal the exact amount that they were allotted. So there were local commissioner hearings, and those hearings actually did award the landowner significantly higher, but obviously EPP countered, and they were locked in court back and forth for close to 2.5 years while the pipeline was going in the ground. So essentially a quick take where the company is able to take their land regardless of any kind of agreement. And certainly through just a matter of conversation of the landowners, there never was their fair market value, is what I've learned.
This is Seth Chase. Can you describe a little bit how this impacts Vermont other than the global climate impact? Texas law is obviously significantly different from Vermont law. How does this tie to any of the current legislation that we're looking at or Vermont law, please?
Sure. So, I'd asked that question to Rob, and I'd asked that question to the folks that I've been working with down in Texas, and specifically the gentleman that I mentioned, Coyne Gibson, who's best described as an insider, is that this really is a global issue. And when we start playing, regardless of the state in this country, when we start playing as companies are in terms of an oligarchic behavior, and when they start buying a law, through lobbying, through the availability to check a box that says common carrier, and use the practice of eminent domain, it just furthers the power of private companies versus the law. And, in my mind, personally, I never really understood the nature of eminent domain and how it varies from state to state. And, I'm currently living in Oklahoma, and it's very much a similar situation as Texas, and Vermont obviously is ahead of us significantly in multiple ways. But if there are laws passed in Vermont that, specifically to the idea that eminent domain cannot be used for fossil fuels, that's a statement to this country. That's a statement of, protecting private property. That's a statement of protecting our basic human rights. And essentially, if many of these companies want to speak to the idea of American independence in energy, But when we start selling overseas, that affects all of us individually. So to me, that's why it matters.
Nicole, I'd just like to, this isn't a question, but just looking big picture, that the Energy Transfer Partners is, who also, as you said, built the Dakota Access, or are building Dakota Access Pipeline. Enbridge is one of the owners of that company, which is also the parent company of Vermont Gas. So it's part of the same web, and obviously you can't hold different people responsible for actions of other people, but the connections are there. The financial connections
Right.
are still there.
Yeah, I actually did have an investment company reach out to me specifically a couple of years ago that were finding concern in Energy Transfer Partners, and I essentially just shared all of this information. And, you know, obviously I take serious issue with this company and their associates, but in discussion with other oil and gas companies, there's been a lot of concern about them specifically and their behavior. So I think it's valuable to really consider that.
Any further? Any other questions from the committee?
Thank you, Nicole.
Well, thank you.
No questions. This is Representative Mike Yantachka. Don't have any questions, but it occurred to me as I was watching the films that a few years ago there was such a big protest about the use of government lands for grazing, and what a big uproar that caused. And yet there doesn't seem to be any kind of similar protest on the fact that gas or oil companies are usurping the land.
Yeah, Texas. I don't know what to tell you. It's Texas world, and to me, just as a storyteller, and we're seeing it within this border wall conversation, and we need to really reach the silent majority and those that are really asking questions about what's going on with these companies, and the fact that we're essentially witnessing an industry that's behaving like a dying animal. The best way to describe it, and they'll do just about anything in order to continue this level of extraction. And so it's beginning, believe it or not. I mean, there are folks, and as I mentioned to Robin in the audience last I was there, I mean, NIMBY is a very powerful thing, and so when you get white conservative cowboys saying not in my backyard, they may actually have a further say than many of the people in, say, North Dakota. And it's coming. And there's a new pipeline happening through Central Texas called the Permian Highway Pipeline. It's going, I don't know if you know the area, but through places like Fredericksburg and Hill Country, and which is a lot wealthier. It's a little bit more condensed. It's a pipeline that's taking about 1,000 landowners' land, and they've raised just over $1 million, which is pretty significant as far as like an uproar against a pipeline in Texas. And a couple of the lawyers that we have worked with along the way are really positive about it, because, again, it's just the same play, essentially getting it to the border. So there is an uproar, and this one particular pipeline, I think, has more of a chance to be fought versus Trans-Pecos, but they're coming. And, you know, again, to reiterate why this matters, we need people speaking out against it from a legal perspective, as well as, like I said, many folks who wouldn't normally be in an uproar about it. So, yeah.
I guess maybe I do have a question. This is Representative Mark Higley. So I'm from Lowell, which just had a 21 tower wind project put into place in 2012. As you can imagine, quite a scar across the ridge line. Fortunately, the property owner in advance purchased land all the way down to Route 100. There was a 10-mile stretch of new poles that had to go in, which were much higher. And as you can imagine, even a project like that, I was told that if the original property owner didn't own the property all the way down to Route 100, would have to use eminent domain to get that power down to the transmission lines. I guess my question is, you know, in any, you know, it is different in the sense of where the usage is going to go, but in any issue regarding new transmission lines or pipelines or whatever, there's always going to be environmental concerns. And I guess I wonder what your response is to using eminent domain for connecting up wind projects or whatever that are very controversial up here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately we have to dig deeper into the question of what is public good, right? I mean, I'm certainly not opposed to the idea of, in the situation of Trans-Pecos, there was a conversation in the beginning that a little town called Presidio that sits at the border that's running off of propane, there was an idea that they would actually have access to this gas. And I'm of the mindset, well, I'm be the first to say I hope Presidio has access to this gas, but that's not the situation at all. It would take a multi-million-dollar project, a completely new entity, most likely West Texas Gas, to build the infrastructure, and none of that has happened. So again, you know, those on the beginning of a lot of our propaganda of these projects, I think by virtue of the law, we have to start digging deeper into asking that question: what is public good? Who's providing, you know, the outcome of this wind farm? Where is it going? What is, you know, and to whose benefit? And, you know, we talked a little bit about this while I was there. It's like, you know, the idea of climate change should be put into the question: what is public good, right? So, I mean, maybe it's a pie in the sky in the idea, but I just think laws need to be put into place that really, truly ask that question. And so, again, going back, why would this Texas story matter in Vermont? I mean, there very well could be a massive pipeline going through your land that has absolutely nothing to do with even a United States citizen, you know? So, yeah, so I mean, I hope that answers your question, but I'm not opposed to allowing, you know, this energy to reach us, but the point is really truly asking the question and not allowing these companies to run ramshot over our property, perpetuate climate change, infringe on water rights, and, you know, flare gas when no one's buying it. Yeah. So it's just that all of those questions need to be asked and dug deeper, I think.
Well, thank you.
No, you're welcome. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I appreciate your willingness to talk with us by phone.
No, you bet. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. It's an honor, and yeah, just keep me posted on the outcome.
Thank you, Nicole.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You bet. Have a great day.
Bye-bye now.
So when I went down to the event at VLS, it was a panel discussion about eminent domain, and there were people from, you know, who had been involved in the Vermont gas pipeline. So it was a much, this served as a backdrop for a more focused discussion on Vermont issues. And I realized this seems like a big jump for us, but it does tie into many of the same issues of land use, of what is public good, what are the rights that we accord to companies and utilities.
You know, just to make you aware too, I mean, if she's also, or you're also attributing Vermont Gas to be associated with Enbridge,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Green Mountain Power is associated
Absolutely.
with,
They
you know,
are.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, so you have to look at it all ways.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Was the event filmed?
Yes, it was.
Is it, do you know if it's available?
Do you know how that's
It's online.
John?
It's on.
At VLS?
VLS has it on their website somewhere.
They videotape.
Supposedly upload like within minutes of the close.
And two of the panelists, one, John Echevarria, who testified by phone, I think the day before, and then James Dumont, who was the attorney who was here, I think the day before at that panel as well. And then there was a third panelist, I believe, who was an attorney from Manchester?
He was an attorney, but he'd been involved in the Vermont gas pipeline. And Nicole was the fourth, and then there was a moderator. And I wish I could recreate for you the final discussion where they were just sort of wrapping up their views, and Dumont and Echevarria were saying, you know, and I forget who was saying which, you know, but eminent domain is a really valuable tool for any kind of progress that we need to make. You can ban fossil fuel pipelines, but don't touch eminent domain.
That would have been John Echevarria.
and the other saying, fossil fuel pipelines are a bad idea, and you can ban them, and get rid of eminent domain in terms of fossil fuel with use. It's the most powerful tool you have to.
That would have been James Dumont.
So it was just interesting debate, and in it, I mean, Nicole kept defining herself as a storyteller. She said, I'm not an advocate, I'm not a politician, I'm telling a story. People can draw what they can, or what they will from it.
Yeah, my biggest problem with eminent domain is that it's all done in secret. And you can have two landowners side by side. One can get a deal from the
utility
conveyor, utility, whatever, and that is kept secret. The other landowner could be negotiating, and they could get a better deal because they're holding out, or if they're at the end of the line in terms of the eminent domain process, they could be getting a much less deal because they're dealing with standing in the lane, and they get more pressure that way. So it's the transparency of eminent domain, the way it's done in the state, is really an issue for me.
So this afternoon, we are going to meet after the floor. I don't think there's a lot going on the floor today. So, let's say 10 minutes after the floor adjourns, that we'll meet here. That would be great. The only thing that we have on our agenda this afternoon is S95. Jamie, whose last name I've forgotten.
Fidel?
No. Fian is going to join us to provide some refresher, if you will, on S95. Melissa Bailey had joined us with some testimony, I don't know, it was probably a month ago on this. So we're not going to do a lot more with that, but Jamie wanted to join us and provide some more input on that. Luke, I believe, is going to be with us as well. We have crafted what I'm hoping is some clearer language around net metering in schools, which we'll go through. And we're also going to talk about the other amendment to the bill, which relates to timelines. So that's kind of the agenda for this afternoon. And just for everybody's edification, my hope is that we can finish up our work on S95 tomorrow, if we are successful with that. Just looking ahead to next week, that bill would be on the floor on Wednesday, I believe, Wednesday and Thursday. So again, we have another bill that's coming back over to our committee from the Senate, H-133, which they're working on the floor of the Senate today, I believe. That was Abram's bill. So if they're successful in getting that out of the Senate, that should be over here I don't know, mid next week. Yeah.
On that, I've been in touch by email and a very brief conversation with Ellen Chakowski, trying to get a sense that the Senate, assuming the Senate agrees with their committee's recommendation, there's some additional amendments, additions to the bill we passed, which is the miscellaneous bill. And I've taken a quick read, at least, of what the committee is proposing. What we sent over there is coming back intact. There are 3 areas that we sent over. They have not made any changes. The areas that they have added include the small hydro that we took testimony about, but consistent with the testimony we heard about, and a whole bunch of PUC requested what looks like mostly housekeeping and wording changes in terms of the regulatory process, changing the name of a certain kind of a hearing to a scheduling hearing, because that's what actually happens at those hearings, that kind of stuff. But I'll be taking a deeper dive probably on Monday into that and communicating with Ellen about that.
Tim, tomorrow, being it's Good Friday, are we doing something like noon or something like that? Or?
If you're good. That would be great. I would love to do that. So, I can't promise anything, but I think that's a good target.
You're suggesting chocolate and chocolate bunnies.
And I don't anticipate the floor is going to be long tomorrow either. So, but thank you for reminding me.
Also, tomorrow, I won't be here tomorrow, so don't do anything I wouldn't do.
Is that how that works? Do we have that as an agreement?
Okay.
The opportunity.